All right. First of all, thanks for inviting me to speak. I like to come over wherever I can and advertise about our program and talk about quail. Excuse me, my throat, if I clear it a few times, my allergist told me I should have been an accountant instead of a field biologist around dust and pollen. So what I'm going to do really quickly is, first of all, talk to you about our program, its goals, and some of the things that it does, and then specifically tell you about weather events, and therefore maybe you could tell me about the climate and the changes in weather events that may come, and how they affect the life cycle of quail. The Quail Tech Alliance is a relationship and agreement between a 501c3 Quail First, which is a funding agency, and the Department of Natural Resources Management at Texas Tech to do work with a particular mission statement. And that's to further our knowledge and understanding of the northern bobwhite and scaled quail and their habitat relationships, with the goal of expanding the range of sustainable populations. We're going to do this by conducting research, educating new biologists and landowners concerning quail management. Our program original goal was to establish what we call an anchor ranch. Basically, that's a play on words, trying to anchor quality habitat in each of the 38 counties of the rolling plains of Texas, which is about 22 million acres. That was a big bite to chew off. We ended up where we're at right now. We've got 26 ranches that encompass about 1.6 million acres. The program's brought in about $2.4 million since 2010, and we're trying to learn as much as we can. What we do and the way we've attracted these ranches is that we provide them with annual deliverables. They put money into the program, and we've designed it to basically be things that are attractive to them, useful for them, and that also provide us with a great data set. So that maps 26 ranches. We have deliverables, commitments to all of them. They're spread out over about 300 to 400 miles, and so it's a logistical nightmare. But at the same time, it provides us a great data set.
Could you tell me what a deliverable is?
A deliverable is something that we're going to provide to a landowner.
Like what?
Well, like this particular map here is a map that provides call counts, the number of bobwhites that were heard on each of these individual places. So that's one example of a deliverable that we provide to the landowner that allows us to track population changes over time, but also what his individual management activities do on the land specifically. We have the other deliverables are things like fall call counts, information about toxicity of feeds, and all kinds of things like that. So that's kind of about the Quail Tech Alliance. The next information is how does weather affect populations. I've kind of cherry-picked some examples out of the different projects that we have going. Most of the data that you're going to see are from bobwhites that are radial marked with transmitters so that we can follow them and get information about their populations, what's going on specifically. One dramatic example here is if you look at our supplemental feeding study, which is occurring on the 4-6 Ranch near Guthrie, Texas. It's a 14,000 acre study site. We're providing feed for some areas and not for others, and comparing what's going on. What's going to be most interesting to you, though, is the effect that drought has on populations. If you're not familiar with birds, their reproductive organs atrophy, recrudesce during the non-breeding season. And so there has to be sufficient nutrients available when light, the photoperiod, starts to increase and they start to lay eggs. And so on this particular site, the average precipitation is 66 centimeters. During the 2011 drought that we had, the site only received 12.1 centimeters. And what you see is that if you look in the control table down here, that you'll see that 0% of those birds even tried to attempt to nest. Birds that had adequate feed in our fed areas, 78% attempted to nest. Trying to move quickly through this data. If you look at the column on the right, which is more normal precipitation, still not what is even average, but we were trying to call it normal compared to 12.1 centimeters, that's 39 centimeters. What you see is that now there's sufficient precipitation to nest, and in our fed units you get more nesting attempts going on, again because of increased nutrition available. But the big factor here is that drought events like this totally cut off reproduction in this species, and with predation being an ongoing factor, you can see how it can easily cause populations to dwindle fairly quickly. Another interesting bit of data, we also capture chicks. We use thermal cameras so we can capture these chicks, put radios on some of them, and actually get body weight. And there's a lot of information here, but basically what I want you to see is, of the chicks that were able to reproduce, 2011 is over there. The drought year, you can see that body weights are greatly reduced compared to 2012. And so they're unable to grow sufficiently, and therefore they succumb to either predation or they just die during that particular year. Really, really harsh conditions. So precipitation, from the standpoint of providing feed and cover, is a major controlling factor of populations. We're continuing this particular study just this past year. Now we're going to go from heat and drought to the reverse side of the spectrum. There was a major storm event this past February, again on the same area. Average annual snowfall is 3 inches. We had one snowfall event of 12 inches. And of course, again, we have birds wearing transmitters so we can monitor exactly what's going on. And we had a lot of mortality in our birds that didn't receive supplemental feed. And it's pretty easy to see what the factor is. Some of the birds have lost as much as 40% body weight compared to when they were initially captured a few months earlier. And so if you look at the data specifically here, on the y-axis over there, you've got percent survival. This is Kaplan-Meier staggered entry estimator here. On the bottom, you've got month, and on the right axis here, you've got inches of snowfall. You can see survival, snow on the ground for several days. The birds not receiving feed took a major hit. So we're happy our supplemental feeding appears to be beneficial, but the factor of concern is, well, if these type of events become more frequent or more widespread, they definitely will pose a problem for bobwhite populations. That is considered to be a limiting factor in the range of the species, is snow cover as you go farther north in the range. Another event, a lot of things you hear from a lot of landowners. I got hailed out. You ask them about their bobwhite populations. Well, I got hailed out last year, and I've always been fairly skeptical about that, but we actually, the yellow circle is a nest location. We put cameras out on a lot of our nests so that we can monitor what is happening with as far as predation or nest success. And you can see the hailstones here in the date. That nest was actually destroyed by hail. And so we actually recorded that effect. I'm sure it would do the same thing to chicks, potentially adults. And so very little information about this sort of thing. It's only anecdotal, but something of interest. Again, if something like that occurs more frequently, potentially problems as far as bobwhite population growth. I think this is my next to the last slide. Again, looking at the life history of the bird. They are hatched with only a very thin natal down. They can't thermoregulate themselves for about 2.5 to 3 weeks, and then they're still going to be brooded until they're 6 to 8 weeks old, depending on the conditions. So the hen actually has to brood the chicks to keep them warm anytime, all night, and basically anytime during the day when it's cool. So conditions that are cool and actually rainy, a little bit rainy, are very detrimental in the springtime to bobwhite populations as far as chick survival. They become hypothermic and die. And so again, if those kind of things change, for bobwhite populations, your earlier hatches are generally the more successful. So if winter lingers or we have a cooler spring that's a little wetter, even though we really talk about how great rainfall is for bobwhites, usually if it's cool, it can be a factor that causes a lot of chick mortality. If you're interested in what the type of things we have going, here's our website. We've got a lot of newsletters there from the past several years with a newsletter archive. We'd be happy to visit with anybody that's interested in bobwhites. So I believe that's my last slide. Yep.
Questions?
Yes, sir.
The benefit to the ranchers of having quail on their land is, do they get hunters come in and rent out the land? Is that primarily it?
Yeah, well, it's several fold. A lot of the individuals simply grew up with this as a tradition in their family, and so there's some instances. For instance, the 165,000 acre 4/6 ranch, nobody hunts that but family. Then there are other places where they can actually get more per acre for quail hunting leases than they can for their cattle. So it's a major economic incentive. Yes, sir.
So if the frequency of severe winter events occur as we go forward in the future, obviously supplemental feed allows that population to sustain itself a little bit better. So from a management perspective, how does that get resolved? Would there be some sort of tax breaks or some sort of supplementation fund-wise for landowners to, I'm thinking from the government agencies, state agencies.
Right. Great question for the policymakers.
Right.
But, there's potential for that. You name it, the government has got a program to pay. We certainly had CRP, for those of you not familiar, Conservation Reserve Program, grasslands out here that were somewhat effective for wildlife. Some would say actually negative for wildlife. So there's potential. There's Conservation Practice 33 that they're currently paying for landowners to put buffers of land around their fields for bobwhites. So it's not unprecedented if it was found to be effective in preserving the species, and potentially there's a factor that might happen. Generally, you see that more for federally sponsored species, however. Yes?
Why would CRP have a negative? What's the argument that it would have a negative effect on wildlife?
Well, when CRP was first planted, they came in with exotic species. So primarily there were millions of acres of weeping lovegrass and old world blue stems planted in a monoculture, dense monoculture. And so there's no food, no woody component to the cover there. And so I've heard them called coyote reserve programs by some. Again, that's a little anecdotal there, but the other part is not. Since the second phase of Conservation Reserve Program, they actually tried to plant native species, put in a mix of species to actually replicate some type of habitat. So it's some improvement, but CRP has been the most benefit for pheasants where it's adjacent to cropland, and again, you know, a pheasant's an exotic, so.
So it sounds like the argument against it would be it's another boondoggle federal attempt to manage something they should keep their hands off.
Well, it should have been better thought out, you know. But I know some of the guys that actually were some of the ones that had to get that on the ground years ago. They're now retired, and in their defense, they were told to get something planted to keep the dirt from blowing, and they did. And after that, we're kind of sniping at them a little bit. But
Now, another question related, low temperatures and low precipitation are both adverse factors for quail. What about just high temperatures, but when the precipitation is normal, is that an issue? I didn't see that, right?
Generally not. You know, we measure temperatures on the ground, and if you're interested, there's you know, a little article in our newsletter where we've done that. For the most part, even in really hot days, if the habitat is present, they're able to get in during those time periods and are able to cool themselves off and stay without a problem. There are some scale quail work in Arizona where it had a very small sample size. You know, I'm pretty proud of the figures you saw there are excess of 200 birds in those samples there. So, but there's studies over in Arizona a few years ago where they were hypothesizing that really high temperatures are actually killing scale quail chicks. But we examined that in a 2-year study in 99 and 2000, right on the New Mexico-Texas border, and that's where, again, heat days were no problem. Cool, wet days, you saw chicks disappear.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.